And welcome. So let's go ahead and get ourselves started for today. And this is Political Science 1, our weekly Zoom meeting for class number 30672. It is Monday, the 11th of May, 2020, and my name is Paul Savoy. And thanks for joining me this morning, whether you're with me here live or are watching the recording of this course meeting. And remember, of course, this meeting is being recorded and is available for you to review either all or in part by going to our class Canvas page, clicking on the ConferZoom link in the left-hand menu, just as you would if you were going to join this meeting live. And once you click on ConferZoom, then click on the recordings link and then scroll down to the date of the recording to that link, click on that. And you may or may not be prompted for a password. If you are, use the password for this meeting that I provided you in our Canvas announcements section, and you can access the meeting that way. So this morning, pretty much the same thing that we usually do during our weekly Zoom gatherings. First, in just a minute, I'll go ahead and give you some announcements, reminders regarding the course, that sort of thing. Then I will deal with any questions on the topic that we talked about in some detail during last week's Zoom meeting. That is talking a little bit about the presidency. So if you recall, I gave you kind of a broad overview of the Canvas class notes on the presidency that I posted for you last week. So I'll deal with any questions that you have now that you've had a chance to review those class notes more carefully, as well as to take a look at the assigned readings for the presidency, as well as the crash course videos that I assigned for the presidency too. I will deal with any questions that you have with that, because remember, your next discussion forum post assignment dealing with the presidency is due this coming Wednesday. That is May 13th at 11:59 p.m. Of course, remember that due date does not count the automatic 3-day or 72-hour grace period that applies to all of our assignments in this class for the semester. So technically the due date is this coming Wednesday at 11:59 p.m., but you actually have 3 days after that time to submit your assignment to me via Canvas. And if you submit the assignment within that grace period, you'll receive full credit. In other words, I will not deduct points for lateness or anything like that. So we'll deal with any questions that you have about the presidency, and then we'll spend the rest of our time this morning talking a little bit about the subject that you're going to be learning about this coming week between this Wednesday and next Wednesday. And that is talking a little bit about the third national government branch, that is the judicial branch, the federal court system, the folks who, among other things, are responsible for interpreting national government laws. That is telling us what the laws actually mean in practice. So I'll give you an overview of the judiciary notes that I posted up for you on Canvas back last Friday, and deal with any questions that you have with that going forward. So that pretty much is the agenda for today. Now, first of all, as far as announcements and reminders go, don't know that I have much to talk about, except for the fact that if you need to reach out to me at any time during the week, there are a number of different ways that you can do that. One way, of course, anytime is to go ahead and send me an email or a Canvas message, or if you would rather, you could also pop into one of my twice weekly virtual student hours on Zoom. Remember, those happen Monday and Wednesday afternoons, so the next installment will be this afternoon between 2:30 and 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And you can access my virtual student hours by going to our class Canvas homepage, scrolling down past the picture to where it says basic course information. And there I have both the Zoom link for my virtual student hours, as well as the password that you will need to enter if you want to go ahead and join those virtual student hours. And remember, the virtual student hours is not, I'm not lecturing or doing anything like that. It is distinct from the weekly Zoom meetings that we do here on Monday mornings for this class. But again, the virtual student hours are just an opportunity for you, if you want to come in and talk to me about anything that you need to talk to me about, whether it's dealing with the subject matter of this class or assignments for this class, political science in general, or anything that you think I might be able to assist you with. whether it has anything to do with LBCC or not. I am here for you. Please do feel free to stop by and visit me during my virtual student hours. And again, if you want to talk to me virtually via Zoom, but those student hours on Monday and Wednesday afternoons don't work for you, don't fit your schedule, maybe you have another class Zoom that conflicts or whatever it is, please send me an email or a Canvas message. Let me know. And if nothing else, I can go ahead. We can arrange a one-on-one Zoom appointment where we can get together and talk about whatever you need to talk about. Now, the one other thing to mention about those virtual student hours is that when you initially put in, click on that Zoom link and put in the password, you are initially put into a waiting room. And if you are put into a waiting room, that usually means that I'm already talking to somebody else one-on-one. So if you get put into the waiting room, just be patient, hang out for a few minutes. And as soon as I'm ready, I will go ahead and bring you in from the waiting room and we can talk about whatever we need to talk about. So I think that's the basic thing to remind you about, plenty of opportunities to talk to me during the week if you need to. And I definitely do encourage you to do so. About the only other thing that I do want to remind you about, we don't have that many more weeks left in the semester. Things are wrapping up rather quickly. And so just a reminder, and just in case you haven't thought about this for a while, do please make sure that you are working on your Student's Choice project because that is coming due sooner rather than later. And actually, if I go back, bear with me for just a second. And if you take a look at our class Canvas homepage and scroll down to the assignments and due dates section, you'll notice that Student's Choice project is due coming up Wednesday, May 27th. So it will be due 2 weeks from this coming Wednesday. So please make sure that you are working on your Student's Choice project. And if you have any questions about that Student's Choice project, remember back when we made the switch from face-to-face to online, I did go ahead and make some modifications to the project. Obviously, we had to eliminate the service learning options since Long Beach Unified closed all their schools and all the after-school programs and that sort of thing, so people weren't able to do BLAST this semester. But I also added some additional topics for the Student's Choice project. I also reduced the minimum page requirement for the Student's Choice project. So if you haven't started working on that project yet, you might want to start thinking about it because you've got a little more than about 17 days to finish it up. And if you have been working on it and you have any questions, please do not hesitate. Send me an email, send me a Canvas message, stop by the virtual student hours, do whatever you need to do to get your questions answered. All right. Because remember, the Student's Choice project, is worth a significant number of points towards your final course grade. And obviously, as I've been talking about since the very first day of the semester, my #1 goal in all of this is to do everything possible to help you be successful in this class. So don't hesitate if you have any questions about that Student's Choice project going forward. All right. So before we do anything else, let me ask if there are any questions about anything having to do with the class before I go ahead and take any specific questions that you might have about the presidency. So any general questions about the class at this time, and you can either go ahead, unmute your mic and ask a question, or if you'd rather, you can go ahead and put your question in the group chat. So any questions generally about the class before we get started? Okay, great. So let's go ahead and get ourselves going. And as I said, the main thing that we talked about last week during our weekly Zoom meeting was to talk a little bit about the second of the 3 national government branches that the framers created during the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. And if you recall specifically, we talked a fair bit last week, kind of highlighting the class notes that I gave you on Canvas in dealing with the presidency. And if you recall last week, there were 2 main points that I emphasized with you about the presidency. And the first thing that I said was the fact that we as folks living in the United States in 2020, we see, we perceive, we understand the presidency in very different ways from the framers themselves. So the framers, when they sat down to create the presidency in Article 2 of the US Constitution back in the 1780s, had this very different perception of the president than we do today. And so the main question that we looked at in terms of the notes last week was, how did we get from there to here? How did we get from the framers' perception of the presidency to the one that most of us hold today? And remember what we said, that when the framers sat down to create the presidency back during the Philadelphia Convention, the framers really weren't all that worried about the president. They weren't all that fearful. They really didn't think that the presidency had all that much potential to abuse its power, to spin out of control, to threaten people's natural rights in the same way that Congress did. Because remember, from a couple of weeks ago, the framers were really scared about Congress, right? They felt that Congress had the greatest potential to abuse power and spin out of control and do all that potentially very bad stuff. But they really weren't all that worried about the presidency. And we talked about some of the reasons for that last Monday. You know, we talked about the fact that the framers felt like they created this very careful sort of filtration system for the presidency in terms of the electoral college process that they created for the selection of the presidency. So they thought that because of the electoral college, because of this very careful two-step process that they had developed for selecting the president of the United States every 4 years, they felt like it would be pretty difficult for a bad, incompetent, dangerous president to kind of slip through that system and actually become president. So that's one factor. And we also said last week, and I talked about this a bit, and it seems strange at first, that the framers weren't scared about the president abusing power because to some extent, most of the framers assumed that all presidents would be like George Washington, who was highly regarded for his honesty and his integrity and his real lack of power hungriness, if you will. So that was the thought. The framers just didn't fear the presidency in the way that they feared Congress. Now, as we said last week, that's not how most of us see the presidency today, right? You know, as we said last week, that most of us today believe that the president is by far the most powerful and the most potentially dangerous figure in the U.S. national government. And we talked about why that was last week. We talked about how we got from there to here. And we said it's the framers' fault, right? Specifically because since the framers really weren't afraid of the president, they really weren't afraid of the president becoming too powerful and abusing its authority, the framers didn't really sweat the details when they created the presidency in Article 2 of the Constitution. They did not do what they did with Congress in Article 1. They did not very carefully specify what Congress could and could not do. I mean, what the president could and could not do. Pardon me, it's Monday. What can I tell you? So Article 2 talks about the powers and functions of the presidency, but not in a lot of great detail. It's really pretty brief and it's really pretty vague. So now how did that cause us to get from there to here? Well, as we said last week, the lack of detail in Article 2 about the actual powers and the extent of powers of the presidency has enabled modern presidents, meaning presidents since and including Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, it's enabled modern presidents to really easily expand the amount of power that they have as president. And if you've had a chance to take a look at the presidency notes from last week in some detail, particularly the last section dealing with the basic powers of the presidency, you know what I'm talking about. That modern presidents have essentially been able to invent new powers for themselves through the lack of detail in Article 2. And that's why presidents today have powers like the executive order power, part of the role of the president as chief executive. They also have the ability to create executive agreements with foreign governments, part of the chief diplomat power. But the framers really probably didn't intend for the president to have those powers, but Article 2 is vague. So modern presidents invent powers for themselves, and if they get challenged and they're told, "Hey, Mr. President, you can't do that. Article 2 doesn't say that you can do that." Well, the president can come back and say, "Well, Article 2 may not say that I can do that, but it also doesn't say that I can't do that." So that's kind of the main point that we emphasized dealing with the presidency last week. And the other point that we touched on is we looked at some of the information in section 2 of the presidency notes. And we tried to understand why it is that of the 45 presidents that we've now had in the history of the United States under our current constitution, why it is that some of those 45 presidents have been considered to be very effective, very successful in terms of getting things done as president, while a lot of other presidents of the 45 have considered, so, okay, not bad, not horrible, that sort of thing. But we've also had some presidents that have been considered very bad presidents, very ineffective at their job. And so we looked at this section 2 in the notes to try and understand what would be one of the main factors that would cause some presidents to be more successful and more effective than others. And remember what we said. We said that what historical analysis shows us is that the most successful presidents tend to be the ones who are able to build and maintain high levels of public support. So in other words, publicly popular presidents have a greater chance of being successful, a greater chance of getting more things done. And the reason for that, as we explained last week, is that if a president has a high level of job approval, has a high level of popularity amongst a large majority of folks in the public, the president can leverage that public popularity and use it against a Congress that may not want to cooperate with that president, may not want to do what that president wants to do. And because members of Congress are so obsessed with re-election, they'll find it hard to resist a very publicly popular president for fear that the president could turn American voters against those members of Congress that don't cooperate and might cause them to lose their next election. So that's the main stuff that we talked about last week, dealing with the presidency. Now, remembering that the discussion forum post on the presidency is due this coming Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. And now that you've had a chance, hopefully, to look at the presidency notes in more detail, you've had a chance to look at the assigned readings on the presidency, and also had a chance to take a look at the crash course videos on the presidency. Are there any questions that you have about anything having to do with the presidency at this time? And feel free either to unmute your mic, ask me a question, make a comment, or if you'd rather, please feel free to put your question in the group chat and we can deal with it that way. So any questions at all dealing with the presidency at this time? Anybody? Okay, so what I want to do then for the rest of our time this morning is to preview the information that we're going to be looking at, learning about this coming week. So basically from this Wednesday to next Wednesday, because remember, next Wednesday, which will be May 20th, a discussion forum post, the next discussion forum post will be due. It's already up there if you want to start taking a look at it, dealing with the third or last of the three national government branches. That is the federal judiciary, the federal court system. And if you noticed, last Friday, I went ahead and posted up on Canvas both the class notes for our discussion of the judiciary, also the crash course videos for the judiciary, and of course, the discussion forum post for the judiciary. So all that stuff is up and available for you on our Canvas page. So what I want to do is to highlight some of the really important stuff from our judiciary notes that are available for you on Canvas. And one of the first things that you may notice when you take a look at the judiciary notes, and if you're able, You might want to pull a copy of them up right now and start taking a look at them. But one of the first things that you'll notice about the judiciary notes is that they are significantly shorter. They are significantly more brief than either the notes dealing with Congress that we talked about in here 2 weeks ago, or the notes on the presidency that we went over in detail last week. So the judiciary notes are kind of mercifully short in comparison. And there are a couple of reasons as to why that is. One reason is the fact that, in terms of talking about the federal court system, I don't feel the need to put a lot of detailed notes up because guess what? The framers didn't feel the need to go into a lot of detail themselves when they were creating the federal court system, this time in Article 3 of the US Constitution. Now, why is that? Well, because if you take a look at the very top of the judiciary notes, if you take a look at Section 1, Roman numeral number 1, what you'll notice is that the framers thought by far that the federal courts, the federal judicial system, would be the least powerful and the least dangerous of the three national government branches. The framers felt like the federal courts would have almost zero chance of becoming too powerful, spinning out of control, and abusing people's freedoms, taking away people's natural rights, and things like that. So the framers were really worried about Congress abusing power and becoming too strong. They were not really worried about the president abusing power, becoming too strong. They were not worried at all about the courts abusing power and becoming too strong. And for that reason, the framers really didn't see the need to put a lot of detail into Article 3. They really didn't feel the need to constrain the courts from abusing power because they just didn't think there would be much likelihood that they would. So that's one factor. But the other factor, and I'm going to explain this for a couple of minutes because it may seem rather strange when you first hear it come out of my mouth, because it seems like what I'm about to tell you contradicts something that I said at the beginning of the semester, but it doesn't. I'll explain. But here's the thing. The other reason why the framers did not bother putting a lot of detail into Article 3 of the Constitution is because the framers just kind of assumed that the court system for the US national government, our federal judiciary system, would essentially be a copy, a duplicate of the British judicial system, of the judicial system that the framers themselves dealt with back before the revolution, when we were still a series of 13 rather disconnected British colonies. And so they said, look, we assume that the American federal court system is just going to be a copy of the British court system. So, and why reinvent the wheel? So if that's the case, we just don't need to spend a lot of time putting detail into Article 3 about how the courts work and how they're structured and what they can do and what they can't do, because we already know all this stuff. They're just going to be a copy of what we were used to with the British court system. So that's the other reason why Article 3 is really brief and really vague. Now, by the way, how brief and vague is Article 3? Well, Article 3 is so brief and so vague that some constitutional historians half-jokingly suggest that the framers very quickly wrote Article 3, very quickly created the federal court system during the Philadelphia Convention one night during happy hour at one of the pubs that they used to frequent in downtown Philadelphia. Why? Because they argue that Article 3 is so brief that it probably could have been written on the back of a cocktail napkin. Well, is that true? Did the framers really create Article 3 on the back of a cocktail napkin? Probably not. It's fun to think about, but it is a good illustration about how short, how brief, and how really vague Article 3 is in describing the structure and function of the courts. Now, I want to get back to what I was just talking about, because it may have sounded weird to you, right? Because remember what I said, one of the reasons why the framers didn't see the need to put a lot of detail about the courts into Article 3 of the Constitution was because the framers just basically assumed that Article 3, that the federal courts were just going to be a copy of the British court system. Okay. Now, if that statement has alarm bells going off in your head, that's good. It should. Because if you think back to the beginning of the semester, if you think back to the first few weeks of the semester back, and it seems like about 5 years ago now, right, after everything that's happened since then to us in the United States. But if you think back to the first several weeks back when we were still face-to-face in this class, we were talking about all of the steps leading up to the creation of our current U.S. Constitution. We were also talking about the creation of our current U.S. Constitution itself, remember? And remember, I kept saying again and again and again that in creating this new national government, this new governmental system in this new Constitution, one of the main things that the framers tried to do again and again and again and again is they tried to make the new U.S. national government as different as they could, as distinct as they could from the British governmental system, right? And remember the reason that we gave at the time. Remember, I told you, the framers feared that if they created a government for the United States that was too similar to the British governmental system that they escaped from through the American Revolution, they were afraid that the American government would end up behaving like the British government did, that it would abuse its power, it would take on too much authority, it would take away American citizens' natural rights, all of these different things. So the framers said, oh, no, we're not going to make that mistake again, right? And so they tried to make our new U.S. national government under our current Constitution as different as they could from our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, because that was a mess too. But they also tried to make it as different as they could from the British court system. And I gave you some examples of that at the time. So for example, that's why under our system, we have separation of powers and checks and balances, right? Under the British system, they have the opposite. They have fusion of powers. The same folks, Parliament and the Prime Minister, they make laws, they enforce laws, and they interpret laws. Americans said, nope, we're not doing that. We're doing the opposite of that. Also, we have a separate, powerful chief executive, the president. Britain doesn't have that even today. The prime minister is part of parliament. The legislative and executive functions are combined. So again and again and again, as we talked about at the beginning of the semester, the framers were trying to make our system of government as different as they could from the British. Now, hopefully that is all coming back to you. Hopefully that is all still making sense. But here's the thing, right? I keep telling you that the framers tried to create our system to be as different from the British system. And then just about 5 minutes ago, I turn around and tell you, well, when it came to the courts, the framers assumed that our federal court system under our new Constitution would be structured in the same way as the British court system. Now that sounds inconsistent, right? Am I giving you bad information here, or was I giving you bad information at the beginning of the semester? And the answer is no. It sounds contradictory, but there is an explanation that makes sense. And here's that explanation. Whereas the framers tried to make most of our national government as different as they could from the British government, they had a very different attitude when it came to the British court system. Specifically for the framers, the British judicial system, the British courts, was the only part of the British government that they actually trusted, that they actually liked, that they thought actually worked well and effectively. And so when they looked back to what life was like before the revolution, back when we were still a series of 13 relatively disconnected British colonies here in North America, the framers looked back and they said, you know, look, before the revolution, back when the king was abusing our natural rights, back when Parliament was abusing our natural rights, the British courts were not. The British courts before the revolution were still treating the colonists fairly. They were still treating the American colonists just like any other British subject, just like any other British citizen anywhere in the world. And so the framers actually ended up having a lot of respect for the British court system. And that's why when they sat down to create our current Constitution in 1787, they just didn't see the need to reinvent our court system. They didn't see the need to create a judicial system for the United States that was radically different from the British model, because they liked the British model. They trusted the British model. They respected the British model. I mean, as of 1787, the British judicial system had already been in operation for over 700 years. So it had a proven track record of success, of effectiveness, of trustworthiness. And so the framers said, well, why reinvent the wheel with the courts? It's just not necessary. And so that's why the framers left Article 2 really short and really vague. So does that make sense to us so far? Any questions about anything that we've said about the creation of the federal judicial system, our court system in the United States, in Article 3 of the Constitution? You can either unmute your mic and ask me a question, or put a question in the group chat. So any questions here live dealing with anything I've said about the federal courts in Article 3 to this point? Anybody? Okay, so who cares? I mean, why did I spend, 10 minutes or so emphasizing that point? Why is it important for us to know how and why the framers decided that there wasn't a necessity to put a lot of detail into Article 3 of the Constitution? Well, here's the thing. Remember when we were talking last week in detail about the presidency, and remember how I just got finished reviewing a few minutes ago, I got finished reminding you of the fact that because the framers didn't sweat the details with the president all that much in Article 2, that modern presidents have been able to take advantage of that lack of detail to essentially invent new powers for themselves and make the presidency way more powerful than the framers intended for it to be. Remember all that from like 20 minutes ago? Well, guess what? A similar thing happened with the federal courts, with the federal judiciary in Article 3, but it happened while a lot of the framers were even still alive. So it happened in the very early history of the US under the Constitution. So specifically, and I talk a little bit about this in the notes, if you take a look at your judiciary notes, specifically, one second here, towards the end of the notes, if you take a look at section E under Roman numeral number 1, I talk a lot about this fancy sounding concept called judicial review. And as you take a look, if you take a look at point capital E under 1, you'll notice that the power of judicial review began to be used in 1803. And this power of judicial review was created by the US Supreme Court itself. And the way the framers laid out the federal court system in Article 3, again, they didn't put a lot of detail. Basically, Article 3 says this: there shall be one US Supreme Court, and whatever other inferior courts Congress chooses to create. So the framers say in Article 3, well, you know, we really don't care what courts end up getting created for the national government, as long as there's this one court for sure, the U.S. Supreme Court. So we're going to say there shall be one U.S. Supreme Court, and if down the line Congress believes it's necessary to create other federal courts, well, they can do so, right? That's how vague Article 3 is. So the framers specified the creation of this one federal court, the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1803, this still very new U.S. Supreme Court went out and did something huge. In this case called Marbury versus Madison, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1803 invented a new power for itself that the framers may or may not have intended for the courts to have. And I say may or may not intended because constitutional historians and political scientists and others still debate this even today. They still argue as to whether or not the framers really intended for the courts to be able to carry out this massive power that I'm going to describe for you in a moment, called judicial review. They still argue about it today. But the one thing that we do know is that whether or not the framers intended for the courts to have this power of judicial review, they certainly didn't specify it in Article 3 of the Constitution or anywhere else in the Constitution for that matter. So you can read through all of Article 3. You can read through all of the entire Constitution. You can look through all of the amendments. And nowhere is this power of judicial review mentioned. It's simply not there. So we could debate from here until next year as to whether or not the framers intended for the courts to have this power, but we do know for sure they didn't specifically mention it in the Constitution. So if that's the case, how was the U.S. Supreme Court able to do this? How was the U.S. Supreme Court in 1803, in this case called Marbury versus Madison, how were they able to essentially invent a power for themselves? Well, we already know the answer to that question, right? Article 3 is barely there. Article 3 is extremely short and very vague. Article 3, there shall be one U.S. Supreme Court and whatever other inferior courts Congress chooses to create. Article 3 is so vague that the framers didn't even specify the size of the U.S. Supreme Court. They didn't even specify how many judges should be on the U.S. Supreme Court. They left that for Congress to decide in the future as well. So think about it. Article 3 is really, really, really vague. And because it's so vague, because it's so unclear, it enables the U.S. Supreme Court in 1803, at the time run by a Chief Justice by the name of John Marshall. It allows John Marshall to invent what would become a massive power for the U.S. Supreme Court, and one that we as folks living in the United States today rely on every day. And it's this power called judicial review. Now, what is judicial review? Well, I give you a fairly decent, I think, definition of judicial review. Again, point capital E under Roman numeral number 1 in your judiciary notes, okay? And basically, judicial review has two elements, two pieces that work kind of in tandem with each other. The first part, the first element of judicial review basically says that it is the job of the courts to interpret the laws. Specifically, it is the job of the courts to interpret the actual words of the U.S. Constitution and then to tell the rest of us what the actual words in the Constitution mean in reality, in practice. Now think about it. That part, that first element of judicial review alone shows you what a massive power that this is, that Chief Justice John Marshall invented for the courts in 1803 in this case of Marbury versus Madison. That it's the job of the courts, and in the end, the Supreme Court gets the last word on this. They get to tell us what the Constitution means in practice. That's a huge power, especially when you consider that a lot of the language that's used in the Constitution is really vague. So sometimes you think there's lots of different ways that these different words in the Constitution could be interpreted. It's up to the courts to tell us, here's what the words of the Constitution mean. That's a huge power in itself, but that's just the first part of judicial review. Now, the second part of judicial review, which makes this even more massive of a power for the courts, is that once the courts determine what some part of the Constitution means, once they interpret a piece of the Constitution, they can then use that interpretation to strike down any government action that they believe conflicts with their interpretation of the Constitution. So in other words, if the courts believe that some action by Congress, some action by the president, or some action by any of the state governments conflicts with what the Constitution says, the courts can strike down that action, they can kill it, and it's dead, and it's gone. Think about that, folks. That is a massive power that the Supreme Court essentially invented for itself in 1803 in this Marbury versus Madison case. Say, we have the ability to tell all the rest of you what the Constitution means, and based on that, we also have the ability to strike down and end any government action by the president, by Congress, by the states, doesn't matter. If we believe that that government action conflicts with our interpretation of the Constitution. Folks, that is an absolutely massive power. And what makes it such a massive power, as we'll talk about next week, when we talk about our basic freedoms as folks living in the United States, civil liberties and civil rights, what makes judicial review such a massive power for the courts is that because the courts get to interpret the Constitution, the courts also get to interpret our basic freedoms. The courts have the last word on telling us what our freedoms are as folks living in the United States. Why? Because most of those freedoms are listed in the Constitution. So it's the court's job through judicial review to interpret them. And as we'll see next week, the courts interpreting our freedoms through judicial review is this massive power that has dramatically changed and continues to dramatically change what our freedoms look like as folks living in the United States over time. So you see how that works? First of all, are there any questions about this power, this two-step power that we call judicial review? Does that make sense to us? And you can either unmute your mic, ask me a question, or put a question in the group chat. So any questions about this concept invented by the Supreme Court in 1803 because of the vagueness in Article 3 called judicial review? Does that make sense to us? And obviously, we're going to talk a lot more about it next week when we talk about civil liberties and civil rights, our basic freedoms. But any questions about judicial review right now? I got a yes. I assume that means no questions. Are we good with that? Okay. So those are the main highlights that I wanted to emphasize for you about the judiciary class notes that are available for you on Canvas. So what I would like you to do Once you get done with your presidency discussion post, of course, finish that first. But once you get to the judiciary between, this Wednesday and next Wednesday, and as you're going through these judiciary notes in more detail, please also take a look at the other stuff I have in the notes, because I also tell you, because remember how we said a few minutes ago that basically, with some exceptions, but basically the US court system is pretty much a copy, pretty much a duplicate of the British court system, right? And so in the notes, I give you some examples of the most important elements of the British court system that we have inherited in the United States and that we use in our court system today. So make sure you take a look at those as well. Also, please make sure that you do the assigned reading for the judicial system. You find that information in your assignment outline and reading schedule, which is on our link is on our Canvas homepage at the very top. And also make sure you take a look at the crash course videos that I included for you in the judiciary module on Canvas dealing with the court system as well. So make sure you take a look at all of that stuff in preparation for responding to that judiciary discussion forum post. So coming up this coming Monday, our next weekly Zoom meeting at 8 a.m., I'll deal with any questions that you have left over from our discussion of the judiciary that were just wrapped up today. And then I'll preview the notes that I will have posted for you on Canvas by next Monday, dealing with the next section that we'll be talking about, really the last major section of information that we'll be covering in this class this semester. Yay, we're getting towards the end finally, right? And that deals with our basic freedoms as folks living in the United States. So we'll learn a little bit about our civil liberties and our civil rights. And we'll see, as I just got finished talking about, how what we have and how much we have in terms of basic freedoms as folks living in the United States is pretty much determined by the courts using their judicial review power, because most of our basic freedoms, most of our civil liberties and civil rights are listed in different parts of the Constitution, okay? So we'll talk about that next week. Now, remember, in case you weren't here at the beginning of class, remember, we're not that far away from the end of the semester. And remember that your Student's Choice Project is due 2 weeks from this coming Wednesday. So Wednesday, May 27th. So if you haven't been working on your Student's Choice Project for a while, now's the time to get to it. If you haven't started your Student's Choice Project yet, now's a really good time to start getting to it. Don't wait for the last minute. That information's available. Click on the Assignments tab on our Canvas homepage in the left-hand menu. Scroll down to Student's Choice Project. Click on there. Take a look at it. If you have any questions about the Student's Choice Project or any questions about anything having to do with the class, as always, please feel free to reach out to me. Send me an email, send me a Canvas message, or stop by during my twice weekly virtual student hours. The next installment is this afternoon. That is Monday, May the 11th, from 2:30 until 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. That's every Monday and Wednesday, 2:30 to 3:30. And if you want to join the virtual student hours, go to our Canvas homepage for this class, scroll down past the picture to where it says basic course information. And there you'll find the Zoom link for the virtual student hours, as well as the password that you'll need to join those virtual student hours. So that's it. So reach out to me whenever you need to, whether it's something to do with this class or anything, even if it has nothing to do with this class. If you just had a tough day, a tough week, a tough weekend, whatever it is, and you need to vent, as I've been saying for weeks now, we are going to get through this class successfully, and we are going to get through this really tough stage in all of our lives successfully, because you are not alone. We are connected. Please feel free to reach out to me for anything that I can help you with. You are truly not alone. And so I got a question, will there be any Long Beach Blast meetings for next semester? Well, it all depends. Now, I'm assuming that next semester, Long Beach Unified Schools will be back. At least they should be back face-to-face. If they are, then chances are Long Beach Blast will be offered starting in the fall semester. If for some reason they're not back, or they're back part-time or whatever it is, honestly, at this point, I don't know. Long Beach Blast doesn't know. Long Beach Unified doesn't know at this point. So at this point, I really can't tell you. But what I can tell you is, if when we get to the fall semester, if Long Beach Blast is in operation, I will offer it as a student's choice project option. That is for sure. But as of this point, as of May 11th, 2020, none of us have any way of knowing as to whether or not Blast will actually be able to offer mentoring services to Long Beach Unified students starting next fall. So we'll have to wait and see. But thanks, Eduardo, for the question in the group chat. So any other questions before we go ahead and adjourn for this week? All right, so have a good week. Be well, stay safe, and remember, if you need me for anything, I'm here for you. You're not alone. Thanks for getting up early on a Monday to join me today, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye. It's my pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.